Yeah, so I think Zoom is actually having problems. If you ever can't see the video or something, we have the slides in the website, so you can follow along if like the video ever gets frozen or something. Okay, cool. So welcome to workshop 7. In this workshop, we're gonna implement authentication. So what authentication will allow us to do is add one of the missing core features to Catbook. So in the last workshop, we left off Catbook with persistent storage, being able to post and get stories and comments. But everyone was anonymous or a hard-coded string, and you couldn't actually log into an account because we didn't have the concept of logging in. So that's what we're going to implement today. So before we get into actually implementation, we have to talk about authentication and what it actually means. So I'm sure that you guys have used authentication almost every day. It's just simply a method of identifying who's using a website, app, service, whatever it is. And there's many ways to authenticate. With an iPhone, you have Face ID. With MIT, you have an ID card. With fancier stuff, you have like fingerprint scanners or stuff like that. But we're just going to talk about passwords for this workshop because that's the most simple to explain and also the one that's most commonly used in the web. So when we get to design how we're going to do authentication, the simplest way to do it is to simply store the password inside your database schema. And whenever someone tries to log in, you can just pull up the user entry or the user document and then compare the password to the password that the client sent. So can anyone think of a reason why this would be bad? I just realized I can't see the comments. Great. One sec. There we go. Well, so the reason that this is bad is because if someone hacked your database, or simply you like pushed your Mongo SRV to a public GitHub repo, someone will be able to look through your whole database, get all the passwords of all your users, and log in as anyone. And even worse, most people don't have unique passwords for every single website they use. So if someone logged into your website and someone hacked your website and read all your users' passwords, they will most likely be compromised across a bunch of services. And we really don't want that because you'll get in a lot of trouble for this. So we're going to be talking about password login. So if you can't actually store the password in your database schema, where do you store it? And in the web, there's two main ways to do it. The first one is something called a session. And the second one is something called tokens. Both of these are commonly used and they have their own pros and cons. So I'll explain both. The first one is sessions. So a session is basically the server remembering what client was making requests. So let's say you make an API request called login. The server will make a little spot in its memory saying this computer logged in with this password and username. So whenever this computer makes another request, I know that it's the right person because it's the same computer. So you make an API request called login. The server will make a session for you, and it will respond with something called a session ID. You save it in a cookie. A cookie is basically a way that your browser stores information. So you put the session ID in a cookie. Then whenever you make another request, you send the cookie with the request. The server will get the session ID from the cookie. It will check that the session is legit, and then treat you as if you were the authenticated user that created the session. And then it will return whatever data you want. So the problem with this, it's not really a problem, but one of its cons is that the session is stored in the server. So like in the previous example, when you made the login request, one computer, either in Heroku, Raspberry Pis, or whatever, had to reserve a spot in its memory for remembering who you are. So that means that any subsequent request will have to be to that same computer that knows who you are. So if you have two computers, one in LA and one in Cambridge to handle requests all around the US, if for some reason you make an API request to the LA server while you were logged in the Cambridge server, the LA server has no idea who you are, and you will get a bunch of errors. And the other problem is that it still has to have a chunk of memory reserved for you. So that means that if many users try to log in, you will have to store a bunch of information. And when you have 1 million users, this becomes really cumbersome. So the second approach is something called token-based authentication. So with token-based authentication, you make an API request the same way, but instead of creating a session for you, the server will create something called a token. A token is basically a small object that contains information about the user. It contains like passwords, who you are, your identity, stuff like that. It is encrypted, and there's like a specific schema that you can find online for this. But essentially, this token is something that proves who you are. The server then sends the token back to the client, and the client stores this in its memory. Actually, one side note, when I was reviewing this before lecture, you don't want to store your token in a cookie or local storage or something like that, because hackers can hack into like Chrome and Firefox and steal your token. What you actually want to do is store it in JavaScript memory, so save it as a variable. But we won't have to worry about that. So once a client has the token, it will send it back to the server whenever it tries to make any authenticated request. And the server is able to look at this token and validate it and say, okay, you're actually who I think you are. And it will handle the request the same way. Again, someone could always steal your token, and it's really hard to get security right. But someone could potentially impersonate you if they steal your tokens. And this is actually a pretty popular attack. But the main thing you have to remember is that with tokens, the authentication is stored basically in the client. And with sessions, it's stored in the server. So even though like this was an oversimplification of everything, storing passwords is actually really hard. You will still have to like store your password somewhere, regardless of whether you use sessions, tokens, cookies, whatever else. And this is very hard to get right. You have to use like hashing, salting, encrypting, a bunch of things that will take a bunch of time to implement. So the best way to store passwords securely is to just not store them at all. Is to let another company that got this right do it for you. So in this class, we're gonna let Google do it for us. There's other password services, but Google is the simplest one we have found yet. So the way that Google Authentication works is that you give Google your email and password. Then the Google Auth server will return a 200 response code and tell you were successful. And then you will tell the server that you logged in as some email. And now the server will link this email to some user in its database and return the information about it. So there's a couple of ways to get this wrong. So the general notion with security is that you can never trust the front end, because anyone can change the front end, even though bundle.js looks like a mess of code. There's people that are really good at coding and really good at figuring out how to hack websites, and they can change anything about the front end code, which is why we need to separate the code into a server code and client code. Essentially, you treat everything in the client as hacked. One example of this is if the Google Auth server says that you got the wrong password, you could still tell the backend that you logged in as that user. And the server will say like, oh, okay, if Google says it's okay, then that will go to the backend, get your data, and return it to you, even though you actually got the password wrong. So the way that the Google gets around this is when you log in as someone, it doesn't return a message like you logged in. it returns a token. This token can only be made by the Google server, because it has some secrets and it has some specific way of making the token that no one can replicate unless they hacked into Google servers. And last time I tried that, I failed. So I trust that Google servers are secure. So with this token, the client stores the token in memory. Then whenever it makes a request to the server, it says, hey, here's the token that Google gave me. I'm legit. The server will then take this token and then ask Google, hey, is this token legit? And then the Google Auth library will say, yes, this token is legit. And that's how it's sure that the client did not hack the token or do something like that. Because if the client doesn't get a token, it cannot tell the front end. Well, it can. It can try to generate its own token. But because the backend goes to Google again and asks Google if the token is legit, it will figure out that it's wrong. So the hacker, unless they hack Google, they cannot hack your website. That's maybe too strong of a claim. There's ways to get around it that Kai might get into, but let's not worry about this for now. So in this workshop, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to create a login and logout button. Actually, let's stop right now. And I'll stop for questions, because I know that I threw a bunch of information at you really quickly. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. Cool. It looks right. Yeah, so Kerberos does use kind of like the same authentication. It uses certificates, which is slightly different, but it's kind of the same idea. Essentially, MIT tells you like, hey, this certificate is your proof that you're actually a student. And whenever you make a request to some MIT site, you attach the certificate or you log in again. And that's how it works. Cool. Give me 1 second. There we go. Oh, I think there's another message in the chat. Yeah, so essentially our database will store basically the email, user information, and other stuff like that. We actually don't use email. We use something called a Google ID, which I will get into in step like 6, I think. But Google essentially has an ID specific to every single person. Cool. So I'll have you guys do git reset, git fetch, and check out to workshop 7 starter. Also note that you will have to do npm install again, because there's a special Google library that I added. So you won't have this library when you start. So make sure to do npm install. To answer the question in the chat, yes, we can interact with Google APIs. However, that will require a little bit more setup. All we have set up is Google Authentication for you. But if you get Google's permission, you will be able to use Google Docs and Google whatever. Cool. So the first thing that we have to do is create a login and logout button. So let me break down the code a little bit. So in line number 8, we have something called a Google Client ID. So Google essentially needs to know which website is trying to use Google services. And when you create a new project in the Google Developer Console, it will give your project a client ID. And this is what you want to put in your front end. This is completely secure. You don't care if a hacker knows your client ID. So you put your Google Client ID there. You can use the one in Catbook for that. You don't have to worry about it, but we did make a little bit instruction stock about how to set up your own Google Client ID, because you will need this for your actual website. You cannot use the Catbook one. And it's web.2/client ID. Again, the slides are in the website, so you can look this up after class. Cool. So we have a library that gives us something called a Google login component. A Google login component, essentially, it's a Google login button that appears on your site. And it takes a couple things in. It takes in the client ID that Google gave you. I didn't understand. I have a Google Home in the background. That was kind of creepy. It takes in the Google Client ID. it takes in the text that it should show, like login, and it has two functions, on success and on failure. On success is code that's going to run after the user has successfully logged in. On failure is what it should run whenever it fails. Again, these are callbacks. Whenever generally you see something called on something, so on success, on failure, on change, on close, on open, stuff like that, it normally means that it's taking in a function that's going to run after something happens in your website. So if we open CapUp right now, yeah, if you close the login pop-up, it's going to call on failure, I believe. At least I haven't tried it, but that's what makes sense to me. Cool. So if you already have the hot loader running, you can go into localhost 5000 and look at the console after you click the login button. That button is going to take a little bit of time to finish. But essentially, if you go to the console and run npm run hot loader, and you open the console in your website, you're going to see this in the console logs. After you log in, this is the information that Google returns to the client. And it has a couple things. It has something called a token type and an access token. And it has your Google ID, and it has more information about you, like where my profile picture is, my name, stuff like that. And this is the information that the client is going to use to tell the server who you are. So the first step of this workshop is going to be making a logout button. The logout button will work very similarly to the login button, with one difference. We want to make sure that the login button shows up only when you're logged out, and the log out button appears only when you're logged in. So as a hint, remember that there's something called conditional rendering. So you can use a variable to render one component instead of another. And you can also save the state of whether you're logged in or not inside the component state or React state. And you will want to change the state whenever you handle the logout or the login events. Cool. So I'll give you guys around 2 minutes for this, or maybe 3 minutes. We're running a little bit low on time. Cool. Oh, again, sorry, I might not have made this clear. This will be in nav4.js. This is where we're handling authentication. Yeah, you can sign in with your own Gmail. I'll start coding this step a little bit, and then we can go from there. So the first thing we want to do is store in state whether or not we're logged in. So in the constructor, we could do something like this. False. And then after you're logged in, you want to make this true. So you want to do this step. Also, is the text flanked? Can you guys see this? Yeah, okay. How about this? Okay. So we're going to do something like we wanted to have the same idea whenever we log out. So actually, yeah. So we want to create another function that handles logging out. So we do something like cool. All right, so right here, we have currently only the login button. So we want to do curly braces to start writing JavaScript. We're going to say like this state log in. So this is called a ternary operator. After the question mark, the first thing that you put there is what should trigger or what should render whenever that variable is true. So when you're logged in, you want to do, sorry, that's my very sad lecture and not paying attention to it. Just copy this. And instead of handling logged in, we want to handle the logout. So this is more or less how your solution should look. And if we go to the hot loader now, I'll be right back. I got a dog during quarantine and he like hates it when I don't pay attention to him. It's very sad. And yeah. So unless I screwed up the code somehow. There you go. So it changed. And when you log out, it doesn't trigger anything because I screwed up the code. Interesting. Oh, did I run? What's wrong there? So if something's not working, the first thing to look at is look at the console. And we say v is not a function. That's pretty weird. Oh, I see. So it's slightly different. It's not on success. It's on logout success. And now reload the site because I changed a component or we change a callback. We do a login. So what happened here is that we got a token from Google and then we can log out and we set the state back to logged out. Cool. So now that we've done that, we want to check out to workshop step 1, and you're going to have the code that I wrote there. Again, this is ternary operator, and this is how you want to handle conditionally rendering stuff based on whether you're logged in or not. So the next step is to set up our backend to store information about specific users. So we want to create a new model. Like I said on Friday, whenever you want to store something, you got to create a new collection for the documents. So we want to create a new schema, and we only really need to store two things: the name of the person and the Google ID. And both of those fields should be strings. So I'll do that, guys, this step for you guys, since I don't feel it's particularly interesting compared to the other steps. So let me check it out. And this is step 1. So the first thing that we want to do is go inside models and add a new model. In this case, will be called users. Then we want to import the library that we need, so mongoose. Then we want to create a new schema. We use a new keyword here because schema is actually a class, and we want to make a new instance of the class. And once we have the schema, we can create a model. A way to do it is to just tell the export what you need to export. So now we told Mongo what we need to store, and now we need to change our API to do this. Actually, I believe you guys can check out to step 2. That way you guys are caught up with me. And I should do that too. Check the chat real quick. Oh yeah, I'll zoom in. Give me a sec. Is this right? Is this good? I think I'm like reading the chat like a minute or two too late. Anyways. So when you check out to step 2, you'll see a new file called auth.js. This is something that we wrote for you, and you don't have to touch it really. And it makes the login and logout functionality a little bit easier. So what this does is eventually just, it gives you 4 functions. It allows you to verify the token, get the information about the users, create new users, stuff like that. And this is middleware that we wrote for you. Again, middleware is stuff that runs before you handle the request that Express uses. So it has a couple functions. Verify just uses the Google library to verify the ID. Get or create new users. You give it the user data, and it either will try to find it in the database or create a new user. Login handles all the login functionality. So it takes the token and actually retrieves the data from the database. Logout deletes the user from the session. And populate current user, you don't really have to worry about that one. And the way that you will use this is that whenever you handle a authenticated request and you are using the middleware that we provide, rec.user will contain all the data about the user that you need. Cool. So the way that we're storing the user data is by something called a session. So again, like I talked to you guys about in the lecture part of this workshop, a session is a place in memory where the server is storing information about the currently logged in user. A session takes in a session secret, which should not be public. We're making it public because we didn't realize this was a thing until we already had 200 branches in GitHub and it was really hard to update. But this essentially should be an environmental variable because this is used for encryption and you don't want to make your encryption public to other people. And the second line right here at the bottom is app.use. App.use is the way that you tell Express that you should run this middleware before any single request runs before. So right here, whenever you're making a request to our server now, we will use auth.populate current user, which if we see to the code to the right, it will populate all the data about the user that's currently logged in. So for this step, what I'm gonna have you guys do is implement the login and logout functionality and connect it to the front end. So the backend part is actually going to be somewhat extremely simple. All you want to do is go to api.js and then make two new endpoints, login and logout. And all they do is call auth.login and auth.logout. You essentially just want to copy the code that's here because we already wrote the function for you. The more interesting part will be going to navbar.js and actually triggering the login and logout request. So how you want to do this is that in navbar.js, the callbacks return a piece of data called res. This is data that Google will send to you after you have correctly logged in. If you looked at the console, there was like this whole big token object that we logged out. And this was the token. This is where the token object lives in res. And you want to use res.tokenObject.id token and to grab the token that Google gave you. And you want to send this token to the backend. The way that you send the token to the backend is by making an API request to /API/login, which you made right before. And in the body, you want to send the token. And I'll give you guys around 5 minutes for this one. I'll be checking the chat for any questions and stuff. Again, if you're confused, you can just ask in the chat or the questions doc, and I'll be monitoring that. Okay, so I have around 20 minutes left, and there's a lot to cover in this workshop. So actually, I'm just going to keep coding it and just talk along the way. So the first thing we want to do is go to api.js and make the two endpoints. So we want to go to the bottom here and make something called router.host /API / login. So the reason that we don't have to put /API as a prefix is because the server already prefixes anything from API.js with /API. And all we want to do here is called auth.login. And for the other request, same idea. Cool. Let me double check that I imported the library. Cool. Now we want to go into navbar.js. And right here, we want to actually make the request. So we want to get the token. So the token is in Rest.token object. Then we want to do a post request /API/login. We want to put the token as the body. Right here, if you do this syntax, what JavaScript will do for you, or ES6 will do for you, is create an object that has a key with the same name as the value. So right here, if you have a variable called token, and you want to send token an object with the name token, and the value is also the variable token, you can do this, and React will just convert it to you. It's personal preference. I find this to be just neater because I write less code. But if you ever see it in the wild, that's what it's doing. So post is a promise that returns, I'm not sure what it returns, but for now. So again, so for promises, you want to put a function inside the .then that will trigger after after the promise has resolved, so after it's finished. So after it's finished, you want to set state to log in. We want to delete that from here. And same thing with logout. Logout doesn't take any parameters, so you can just make a post request. You put that then. I don't have to check that the token is valid. The token gets checked by the backend. The front end just gets a token from Google, assumes that it's right. If right here, Google didn't give me the correct token, that will be a problem from Google side. And there will be much bigger problems in that case. And yeah, so this is essentially how you connect the two. I won't demo it. I assume it works, and I'll just check out to the next step, which is the way that I live life sometimes. Step 3. All right. For the next couple of steps, I'm probably going to do most of the coding since I have around 15 minutes left, and there's 9 steps in this workshop, so it's going to be a fun time. Okay, so the next step is actually showing you the username. And the way that we do this is by getting the username from Google. So we already have a user ID. We already have creator ID, creator name. We stored a bunch of things in our database already. And the key relationship that we want to enforce right now is associating a Google ID with a name. That object in MongoDB has another ID called _ID. And again, like I said on Friday, this gets automatically generated by Mongoose or Mongo. You don't have to worry about it. So the way that it works is that you log in with your Google ID and your name. Sorry, with your token. Then we get the Google ID, your name, and that document in the database has an ID called _ID associated with the user. We use this ID to link the person with their stories and their comments. So we want to modify the story schema and the comment schema to have their creator ID attached to it. We want to modify how we make stories and comments to also store the creator ID and the creator name, not from the hard-coded variable we had on Friday, but from the information we already have from the Google user. So I'm actually not going to code this since I'm trying to cram the whole lecture, the whole workshop in the next 15 minutes. You can copy office hours if the code makes you confused. But this is essentially how it should look. So what we're seeing here is that we changed the post request to use rec.user and to get all the information about the user. So again, the middleware that we wrote populates a variable called user inside the request. So rec.user._ID is the ID of the document inside the Mongo collection that has the that is related to the user that created the story. And because the user that created the story is assumed to be the person that made the post request, we can simply do rec.user._ID. Same idea with the name. So by setting these two fields right here, now stories will not be hard-coded created by someone else, but they will be actually linked to the name that you have in your Google account. So again, you do .safe and .then to save it into the database. Cool. So for the next step, one thing that we want to do is that although we already have the names associated with it, we want to also display it inside the profile page, because right now, if you go there, it'll be hard-coded to Shannon Wu, I believe. And the way that we do this kind of routing is actually a little bit fancy. So we're using something called Reach Router. So Reach Router has a lot of knobs and whistles that you could do to make fancier routing. So for example, right here, the profile tab, the profile component has a path called /profile/:user ID. So to go into this part of your website, whenever you go to the profile page, you also want to specify the user ID. So you want to make it so whenever you click it, oh, don't forget about that. You want to do it so whenever you try to redirect the user from the homepage or the feed to the profile page, you want to also specify the user ID that that user has. And the way that we do this is by setting a parameter in the URL called user ID. So I'm not sure we have time for this. How about I just code it with you guys and then we go from there. So hold on, let me check the chat really quick. The chat looks fine. So let me check out to the next step. So let's see. Actually, yeah, here again, this is what we want to do. We want to make it so if you go to /profile/some ID, you will go to that specific user's profile page, not a hard-coded Shannon Wu. So we go to, so the component that we want to modify, I believe, is single story for now. So single story, again, if you remember, is the component that displays the story. And single story has a couple things going on. We make this bigger. Single story displays the creator name, and single story displays the content. And what we want to do here is change this to use the fancy routing that we're going to put. So we use a component called link, which is provided by Reach Router, to link to another part on your website. 2 is a prop that it takes, and it takes the endpoint that you want to go to. So we go to /profile/ I think it's like this dot props dot creator ID. This will be a prop that we pass down to single story. That way it knows who created that story. And I believe the styling is ulink and so with this kind of routing, what's going to happen is that whenever you click the creator name or whatever child is between the link tag, whenever you click anything there, it will redirect the user to /profile/some ID. And there's another part of the code that you have to change. So this prop here gets passed down. I'm going to check out that step so I can walk you guys through the code. So we have this file is the same way. This file has the same thing that I wrote. And now we're taking in a creator ID prop. That creator ID prop, I believe, will be passed down by feed.js. We go somewhere here. Yeah. So if we go into our feed, whenever we're making a card, we pass the creator ID and the creator name that the story has. And remember again that we changed the way that we make stories to actually store the name and the ID of the person that made the post request. So it's not hard-coded anymore. So when the feed loads stories, it will create a card initialized with the creator ID. The card, on the other hand, will create a single story and a comments block. The single story will have a prop being passed down called creator ID and creator name. And the single story right here uses this to do the fancy routing that I was talking about. Cool. All right, so we already linked it to the specific user's ID. But if you go to step 5 and run the hot loader, you're going to see that even though the ID is unique, the things that we render there are not unique. So we need to actually get the username from the backend. All the things that we know is the creator name and the creator ID. We could pass down the prop. However, that's a little bit unclean and it's up to a personal preference. And what you want to do is load basically all the user data that you need from a specific user once you go into their profile page, instead of relying on props being passed down from a bunch of places. And creator ID is the minimum amount of props that we need to know who are we supposed to get data for. So for this step, we're going to create a new user route. And I believe that this one's fine to do on your own, since it doesn't rely too much things on the front end and it's entirely in the back end. And all you want to do here is create a new get endpoint. This get endpoint will take in one parameter called user ID. This user ID, you can then take it and call MongoDB to find, use Mongoose to find the user entry related to it. We use another, we don't use find here because there's another function provided by Mongoose that makes more sense here, and it's called find by ID. The way that you use this is that you call user.findById, and it will take in the user ID that you got from the front end to find that specific document. And then you want to send it back to the front end. I'll give you guys 2 minutes before I start coding it up. There's a couple more things that I want to get to, so I might actually just speed through this. So we go to yes. We do like Let's do it here. Oh, by the way, we're finishing at, I believe, 2:30 because there's a sponsored lecture at 3 and we want you guys to have lunch. So, yeah. Yeah, okay, so we got the ID on the front end. And we use query because this is a GET request. And the parameter name is user ID. And now we can use the user collection to find a document by ID. We will put the ID inside. This is a promise, so you can use that then. I believe that this will work right. So this is a GET request that we will just take in the user ID and return all the user data that we have in the database. And this should be fine. Cool. So the next step would be to update how we handle the profile page. So with this fancy routing that we did, we can get the user ID from the props. So what Reach Router is doing here is that you define a variable called user ID inside the URL, or inside, you told basically Reach Router that whatever number or whatever string is after the /profile/, you will pass this as a prop to the component that you're supposed to render. So the user ID inside the string after the colon becomes a prop to the profile component. And this is how we're going to get all the data from the backend. So again, I'm going to do this step for you guys because I want you guys to have lunch. So we go into profile.js. And right here, we use component did mount because this is where we want to start doing API requests because it's the earliest possible we can do it. And we want to do a GET request to /API/user. And it takes in a user ID parameter. And it's available as this.props.user ID. And the backend got this for us. So we want to do let's save this in state. Cool. And let me update the state here. Okay, so when the component mounts, it makes a GET request to the backend, gets the user ID from the props, which get populated by the fancy routing that we did with the colon. Then we want to, so one thing that we added here, because we're actually making a GET request, if we try to load the site right now, what would happen is that the GET request will get called. However, the render function will run before that GET request finishes. And because that GET request has not finished, we have not populated the data from the backend. So what we want to do, what you normally want to do, is have an extra variable right here in state called load. You set it to true. And whenever the backend finishes, or whenever whatever async thing you're running finishes, you want to set that variable to false. And what you use that variable for is you do something like bad syntax. If it's loading, you want to return loading. And And if it's not loading, you want to return everything else. Okay. So all we have to do now is change the hard-coded string right here to this.state. I think it's the name, I believe. Yeah, so when you do this, when the component renders, it makes a GET request to the backend. The backend looks it up in the database. When that finishes loading, and the client gets the data, we're going to render the user data by using this.state.user and getting the name field. And yeah, I think that should be functional. I'm not going to risk it because I think I might have gotten one line wrong. Cool. No, I actually got it all right. Look at me go. Look at me go. Okay. Cool. This is a minor detail, but to make a nice user experience. But you actually can't go to your profile page whenever you are logged out. Or sorry, if you click the profile button now, because the profile link actually now requires you to specify the ID. Clicking the profile button inside the navbar doesn't make intuitive sense right now, or it doesn't know what to do with it. Because what's actually going to happen, it's going to go to /profile/undefined because you didn't pass an ID, right? So we actually want to pass down the user ID to that button in the navbar. And the way that we do this is that we store the user ID in state. So remember the navbar made the request to log in. And because it made the request to log in, it also has all the data about the user that logged in. So we can simply store it in state. We can say we can store a state variable called user ID and retrieve that from the response from the server. And we can pass that down to the button in the navbar. And of course, when you log out, you want to set that to null or undefined, both work. So the big question is if it works. So it actually doesn't work correctly. If you refresh, it's not going to work. And the reason that it doesn't work when you refresh is because React loses all state whenever you refresh the whole page. So even though you had already logged in, if you refresh, the state will be lost and the button will have no idea what user ID is. So the way to get around this is by asking the server if you're currently logged in. Remember that because we use a session, we are able to talk to the server and the server will remember us regardless of how many times we reload the page. And if we are logged in, the server will return all the data that we have about the user or tell us that we're logged in, however way you want to design it. So what we want to do is that when we load the page for the first time, we want to make a request first to the backend saying, hey, I know the user has not clicked the login button yet, but by any chance, was I logged in the previous before the refresh or when the user last visited the site? And this is how you'd only have to log in once to most things, because the server, or the session, or the cookies, or the token, one combination of those things is enough to retrieve your logged in or logged out state. And again, I'm going to go through the solution. So we want to make one endpoint called who am I? What this endpoint does is it tells you who you are, which is a question I've been asking myself for many years, but apparently it was just a GET request. So the way that who am I works is that it goes to the session, checks that if the user ID exists for this specific client. If it does, it returns it. If it doesn't, it says, no, you're not, and just returns an empty object. And we can use this endpoint to automatically retrieve the user data before they even click the button. And another nice UI thing is that we want to make the profile page load if, sorry, we want to make the profile button appear if you're logged in and disappear if you're not, because you cannot click it or it will not lead anywhere. So if you check out to step 8, this is the GET request that you want to make. And the GET request, all that it does is it asks the server. It doesn't need a token, by the way. The reason that it doesn't need a token is because we're asking the server, which already kind of knows who we are. And internally, what's happening is that we use the session to retrieve the session ID. The session ID retrieves a token. It's a little bit complicated. And we can talk about this more in office hours. And I think our code actually needs some fixing because this authentication feels somewhat insecure. But the idea is to make a GET request to some endpoint that will retrieve all your user data. Then you get the response and you set that as your state. And with that, you're able to populate all elements that need any user data. And you can treat it as if you were logged in, or as if you clicked the button, logged in, and you got the callback. And there's a couple more problems that we have here. And the problem is that many things on our site will need the user ID to actually work. So now that we're actually using user IDs and actual legit authentication, many of the things that we do in the site need to have the right data. So for example, hitting the submit button doesn't work right now because all the submit button does is make a post request to /API/story. But the submit button does not have your user ID. So it doesn't know who you are. So we want to make sure that we never show the user something they can't do. So the submit button should only work when you're logged in. So the way that we figure out whether you're logged in is by deciding by checking if the user ID is logged in or not. So right now, this is kind of how our hierarchy looks. And we want to change it because we want to make sure that some components are only rendered when you're logged in or not. And one easy way to implement this is figure out which things need to know whether you're logged in and make a GET request every single time that thing renders. However, this is very inefficient and it will make a bunch of GET requests that will return the same response and cause a lot of performance issues along the way if your app gets more complex. So right here on our site, there's 3 things that need to know the user ID. And we only really need to make one request. We don't have to make a request in the feed component. We don't have to make a request in the navbar and the comments block. We only need to make one. So we can rearrange our code a little bit to make it a little bit nicer and make the app, the top level component, do all the GET requests or all the API calls that we need and pass everything down as a prop to all the components below it. So we have rearranged the code for you in step 9. And in an actual normal lecture, you wouldn't do this. We will do all this rearranging for you because it's a little bit cumbersome. But this is now how our app kind of looks. So app passes the user ID down as a prop because the app does the GET request to the server to get the user data. And it will only render components and some components will only be rendered if the user ID prop is being set to an actual user ID and it is not null. And the way that you do this is this is a fancy notation. And instead of saying if this.props the user ID, render this, you could do a double ampersand and render the right component conditionally on the left variable. Or you can also chain as many Booleans as you want. And with that, this workshop is over. Again, I kind of rushed through the whole explanation. So feel free to come office hours, make Kiosk post, ask in the questions talk, do whatever you want. I will give you answers. And there's optional homework in the slides that you can do for you if you want. You have spare time.